It's that, that's where I was going to ask you next regarding the charter.
Yeah,
Every time you have these so-called shows, Piers Morgan and other individuals who are paid by media organizations who are somehow connected and linked to this type of Zionism, thought process. They always first question, of course, Brother
yeah,
Yusuf, is asked, "Do you condemn Hamas?" Okay, let's get that cleared first.
yeah,
Then it's the charter. The
yeah,
charter clearly says that we need to wipe out the Jewish state, this
yeah,
land. Please give the
yeah,
audience some understanding regarding this. And also, I want to touch on the Hasbara,
yeah,
Israeli propaganda machine,
yeah,
if you
yeah.
don't mind sharing your
No,
thoughts on
sure,
that.
sure, sure. Yeah, I think that's one point. Firstly, Hamas, prior to its formation in '87, was a movement that was a benevolent movement, and that was basically involved in charity. Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. I saw a discussion some years back by Mahdi Hassan, which was apparently refuted by Dr. Azam Tamimi, where Mahdi Hassan stated that Hamas was in fact created or funded at its earlier stages via Israeli intelligence as a kind of a bulwark to the far more militant back then Palestinian, the Fatah, or the Palestinian Liberation Organization, as it was known, because both the PLO and the other movements like the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is run by George Habash, or back then was run by George Habash. There was a Marxist organization. Islamic Jihad never existed, and there was no Islamic movement as such that was basically engaged in any kind of resistance. So the talk is, and again, this has been questioned, I don't know how people view it, that apparently Israel wanted a kind of a more nuanced religious kind of alternative to Fatah, which would be less inclined to engage in any kind of resistance. I mean, and the argument that is put forth is a kind of same similar kind of argument that is made in the kind of the Afghan context, where they basically put the argument that the Mujahideen, or Al Mujahideen, the Taliban and the forerunners to them in the 80s, were basically backed and funded by the CIA and via the Pakistani Inter-Services Intelligence and so on. So the same kind of argument is made in relation to Hamas. And I've seen this by some journalists. I believe there's a book I have here. I think this book here, Jeremy Scahill. I think get this book here if I've got it here. Jeremy Scahill is got a book called British writer, Dirty Wars, the World is a Battlefield. And I think the same kind of argument is put forth. But a lot of other scholars like Dr. Azam Tamimi states that is not correct, that Hamas, in fact, grew as a legitimate alternative Islamic resistance to what they saw was oppression during the First Intifada. And so I don't want to get involved in that particular debate. But now it comes to the issue about the Hamas Charter. Firstly, the one point that needs to be noted about this is that the Hamas Charter, the original Hamas Charter, if you can, those who access it and can in fact read it in Arabic, it's not part. If you look at the official constitution and in fact the official documentation of Hamas as it stands today, the original Hamas Charter of '87 doesn't play any part of it. Two of the Hamas leaders, one was a well-known individual called Khalid Mishal, the other one was Abu Musa Mazrouk, made the point that when it was drafted in haste. So there is no talk about any kind of extermination of Jews as such. And they make the point, Hamas makes the point in relation to the Charter of '87, that when there's any kind of reference to Zionists or the Zionist state, the word that they use in Arabic is Yahud, Yahudi, or Yahud. Now, in the absence, and this is again subject to correction and my ignorance, but in the absence of a terminology or a term for Zionist in the classical sense, in the Arabic parlance for Zionists, they use the term Yahud. But Yahud in the context of not Jews in general, but Jews specifically with an ideological bent towards Zionism and indeed sustaining the state of Israel through its oppression and its sanguinary warfare against Israel. So that's the first point that they make, that the reference to Yahud in the original Hamas Charter is in reference to the Zionists. The second point is this, is that the only reference to extermination, if at all, and in relation to Israel, which is not there's no direct imperative, but there is a mention which we're all familiar with about the hadith of the end times, this kind of eschatological reference, in terms of which, where come the end times, even the stones and the trees will, in a manner of speaking, make mention of the fact that there is a Jew behind me, get him, get him. So when they talk about extermination, they use and they refer to this particular reference in the original Hamas charter, which is in fact hadith. Now, of course, and I know Brother Nazam, and I don't know if he's listening to this podcast, he's well aware that there are different categories of hadith, but be that as it may, whether it's authentic or not non-authentic, the point being made is that hadith on its own is a hadith which details the end times, something which is eschatological, something which is not a direct imperative to kill. And one may add this other point as well, that you find the same thing about extermination of Jews in Christianity. And when I tell some of my Christian brethren, I was having a chat with a Christian pastor the other day, I said that this kind of so-called hadith, which is contained in the Hamas charter, which you people basically have so much of an issue with, well, you find something similar to that in the end times in your own biblical tradition. I mean, if you look, for example, in the New Testament, in the book of Revelation, when Jesus comes in the end time, and he will come with a rod of iron, and in fact, if I may just basically get the reference to in relation to what Jesus will basically do, is that he will basically come. I saw heaven opened. His clothes, that's Jesus, was a vesture dipped in blood. His name is called the Word of God, Jesus. And out of his mouth goes a sharp sword, that with it he should smite the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron. And he treadeth the winepress of the fierceness and the wrath of the Almighty God. And the remnant was slain with the sword of him that sat upon the horse, which sword proceeded out of his mouth, and all the fowls were filled with their flesh. Now, if you get a concordance, if you get a Bible concordance to the book of Revelation, and all those passages about Jesus killing and Jesus slaying, you get a cross-reference which takes you back to the Gospel of Luke chapter 19, verse 27, where Jesus says, of those enemies of mine who would not let me reign over them, bring them here and slay them before me, as a kind of a metaphorical allusion to the end times. Now, who were his enemies? The enemies were his immediate contemporaries, the Israelites, the Jews. He was referencing the Jews. So when he comes, with the exception of the 144,000, he will be slaying all his enemies, all the Jews. They will be all put to the sword, and they will be slaughtered, and they will be massacred. So similar to that, you've got something analogous to that in the Hadith corpus, which gives this idea, and I don't have the Hadith in front of me, that in the end times, even the stones and the trees will be making this so-called proclamation that there is a Jew behind me, get him, get him. So that's what's basically contained in that original Hamas charter. And so when there is a criticism on the Hamas charter, people don't actually know what the criticism is. They assume that this is basically calling for the destruction for the state of Israel, or the fact that this is essentially anti-Semitic. And this is basically invoked by a lot of the critics of the particular movement of Hamas as proof of its failure or inflexibility of recognizing Israel. But the charter is a historical document. It has to be viewed in a particular historical context, which was the context of 1987 and the time of the First Intifada, where there was no military might challenging Israel. The Palestinians were fighting against his tankers with stones and sticks and their own human bodies. But that charter, which people don't tell you, they allude to the 87 charter, that was updated in 2006. When the updated charter came out in 2006, Hamas, in fact, accepted that they would basically accept a Palestinian state. Hamas stated in the 2006 charter that they would accept the Palestinian state on the 1967 borders. but without recognizing Israel, because they believe it's illegitimate. And there's no problem with that. Why should you recognize a state that is founded on the base of illegitimacy? I may add the other point, which the brothers may not know. The ANC government, we are ruled by the ANC government. And there's a lot you probably hear about the corruption and untold corruption within government, particularly during the Zuma administration itself and so on. But the ANC government was a liberation movement. It came up with the Freedom Charter in the 50s. In its charter before the Freedom Charter, the pre-Freedom Charter, I should have emailed you that document, the document before the pre-Freedom Charter. That basic document of the ANC excluded whites, it excluded coloreds, and it excluded Indians from joining the ANC organization, the ANC Liberation Movement. Now, of course, whites, coloreds, and Indians eventually did join the ANC in the 60s and the 70s and so on during the height of its struggle. But at its earliest stage, it was a black supremacist organization. Now, Hamas's political vision has also evolved, one must look at it. Initially, at its earlier stages, you could probably stereotype it as a kind of a Jew-hating movement, but at this particular juncture, or particularly at the point when it won its superficial elections, it clearly showed its indication of evolving. The other point is this, is that Hamas, in its own accord, initially, prior to 2006, it refused to participate in any form of elections in the political process itself. By conceding after the failure of the Oslo Accords that, look, it's willing to participate in the elections in 2005 and 2006, which it won successfully, it offered evidence that it would be willing to function in a modern state and under a democratic system. The other point is this, is that the document, which is known as a Hamas Charter of 87, was long done away with, because if you look at the 2017 Hamas document, which it cites as its own document, because people, when they talk about the Hamas Charter, they're talking about the Hamas Charter of 87, which Hamas and the Hamas leadership has also rejected. The 2017 Hamas document lays down its particular principles in a 42-page document. And what its goal is simply to liberate Palestine from the Zionist project. It certainly has a frame of reference to Islam, and it certainly, because it's indeed an Islamic movement, but there's no reference at any level to the extent that it's going to destroy the people of Israel or destroy the Israeli people. I mean, certainly it's accepted in 2006 that it's willing, if Hamas has accepted that it's willing to accept a Palestinian state on 1967 borders in 2006, how can that now be viewed as somewhat destructive? In fact, the 1967 borders acceptance is a concession. It was also a concession by the Palestinian Authority, the PLO. The PLO initially always spoke about a single state. In 1975, and I was not around in 1975, I don't know if any of the brothers were around. In 1975, that's close to how many years? We're almost in 2025, close to 50 years ago. Close to 50 years ago, the PLO made a concession that it's willing to accept a two-state solution based on the 1967 borders. That was a concession. And from 1975 right up until 2023, we've always been given to let down the alleyway that, look, Israel has always made these concessions and the Palestinian Authority and Hamas has not. But Hamas has accepted the 1967 borders in 2006. The PLO, before the existence of Hamas, accepted the 1975 borders, the 1967 borders, way back in 1975. So what are we talking about here? This is basically a game. It is a false charade that is being put before our eyes, and that is basically being put as a kind of a wool to deflect us from the real issue. And this is the whole point, where Israel always portrays itself as the victim, and it portrays those around it as its basic oppressors. I mean, Bassam Youssef, and I'm not going to repeat the words that he used, but he made the telling point that Israel is like an abusive spouse in a relationship. It basically, in his own words, F's you up and then pretends that it's a victim, like a narcissistic psychopath. That's basically what Israel is. So how far more deeper do you want to go in terms of concession? When the movement which you portray as militant and out to destroy you was willing to accept the 1967 borders, recognize it in its updated 2006 charter in 2006, how can you claim it's out to destroy you? This is a hypocrisy that we basically see. And so I would urge brothers, and if you can put up the PDF, I will try and send a copy of the PDF of this particular book, Why Israel. There's a number. These books are foundational. Why I say they are foundational, there are other good books out there, but why they are foundational is because for the layman out there who doesn't want to wade into detailed information by the likes of Noam Chomsky, or they find some of the material by Ilan Pape and Noor Masalha or Norman Finkelstein a bit complex, this would be the straightforward material to give the core issues on the point, and I'll be happy to share that information out with you on that point. So I think that's basically the aspect on the issue of Hamas, and I think that should just put the whole situation to bed.